What is up, everybody? This is Brian, the Toyota guy, over here at Fred Anderson Toyota in Asheville. And today I just wanted to have a little bit of a conversation on the differences primarily between all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive. Mainly because we've had about 2 snows now here in Asheville over the last month or so. First one was pretty good, about 10 to 12 inches or more depending on where you were. Last one was anywhere between 2 to 6, just depending on where you were. And this conversation comes up a lot. People think that, oh, you've got to have a four-wheel drive versus an all-wheel drive. And there's just some general confusion about this. So I figured I'd spend a little bit of time just to kind of break apart the main differences, the key takeaways, and why one might be better than the other one. So cars, of course, come in a lot of different engine configurations, drivetrain configurations, but primarily the big ones are cars that are front-wheel drive. Think of like Honda Civics, Accords, things like that. A lot of cars that are rear-wheel drive. Think of maybe like a 2-wheel drive pickup, or maybe like a Ford Mustang. That just means the back 2 wheels are getting powered versus the front 2 wheels, like on something like this. And then, of course, you do have all-wheel drive cars. This Mercedes here happens to be all-wheel drive. Somehow this other Mercedes is all-wheel drive. And then, of course, Subarus, a lot of Highlanders, RAV4s, things like that. And then, of course, what a lot of people think of for four-wheel drives would be like your 4Runners, your Jeeps, your full-size four-wheel drive trucks, all kinds of things like that. So one kind of big thing to note about all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive is you can't always trust the badging that is on the back of your car. I have seen a lot of times there's a Highlander over here, there's a Jeep over towards the front that advertise 4x4 or four-wheel drive, when in reality they're more traditionally an all-wheel drive system. A lot of times you'll see it like the older Highlander. I'll even show you. So this is like a 2011 Highlander, and as you can kind of see here with the badging, it pretty plainly states four-wheel drive, but at the same time, it's also kind of shaping that 4 a lot like an A. If you really look at it, you can see, and it's really more of an all-wheel drive system, and I'll show you on a Jeep too. So here's a 2019 Jeep Cherokee Latitude, and if you look right here on the back hatch, it very plainly says 4x4. Now, the reason why I point this out is because by most general understandings of the differences between all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive is, unless the vehicle has a transfer case, meaning you can select 2-wheel drive or select 4-wheel drive, then it is an all-wheel drive system. Now, in defense of that Cherokee, there are some terrain modes that are on there, so you can, kind of tailor the system to be more aggressive in dirt and snow and sand. But honestly, a lot of all-wheel drive cars like these RAV4s behind me already have that feature. But just because it has terrain modes doesn't mean that it's a four-wheel drive. So unless it has a transfer case selector where you can go between the two, then it's generally going to be an all-wheel drive. So you can't always trust the badging that's on the back of the car. So now let's just talk a second about what all-wheel drive is. So all-wheel drive, in most configurations, now there are a lot more different versions of all-wheel drive now than there ever have been, but generally speaking, all-wheel drive vehicles are usually front engine and primarily front-wheel drive, although there's some exceptions like BMWs and a few others that are more rear-wheel drive biased. But regardless, generally the system has a bias towards 2 of the wheels, usually the front 2. And then there is a computer and some hardware that basically connects the front and the rear wheels. And so the computer will dictate when you need the all-wheel drive, meaning all 4 tires are getting the power versus just the front 2. Now, the main advantage for that is that you don't have to do anything. You just drive the car normally. You don't have to select anything. It just operates on its own. Again, some of these cars have, like the Highlanders, have a snow mode. We talked about the Jeep and the RAV4s that have different terrain modes. So the cool thing is the computer can do a lot of the work for you, and it takes a lot of the guesswork out of what you need to do. And then, of course, the other advantage to an all-wheel drive system is if you don't need to have all of the wheels powered at all times, you're going to get a tighter turning radius, which is something if you've driven four-wheel drive, and you'll also get better fuel economy. So there are definitely some key advantages to an all-wheel drive system. Now, something you will see a lot in these all-wheel drive vehicles, you definitely see them in a lot of Toyotas, is this little button here. And in general terms, this button is meant to be, when it has the X there in the middle, that is basically showing an all-wheel drive lock or a center locking differential. On some of the four-wheel drives, you'll see them like on the Tacomas, it'll have an X between the back two tires. That means it has a rear locker. But here's another confusing thing. When you're looking at an all-wheel drive car like the Highlander or the RAV4 or a lot of others that have this button, it is not truly an all-wheel drive lock. What this button actually does, when you push it on, it will direct a 50% split of the power to go to the front and the rear equally, and it will try to lock that percentage in. It is not actually a differential lock, it is just a 50-50 power split. So it's another kind of marketing thing that can be kind of confusing. Now, generally it's a good feature because you do want to have a 50-50 split, because a lot of the times it's more like a 60% bias towards the front, so you might not always be getting the maximum traction. Then here again is like a snow mode. In this specific Highlander, there's a downhill assist, traction control off, a few other things on top of the terrain modes that a lot of other cars have. But I just wanted to point out what that button is and what it generally means, especially on an all-wheel drive vehicle. All right, so now that we've talked the basics of an all-wheel drive system, now let's kind of talk about the two different types of four-wheel drive systems that exist. And really, you can break it down into what's called part-time four-wheel drive or full-time four-wheel drive. Now, technically, an all-wheel drive car is an all-time or a full-time system because it does things automatically. But with a four-wheel drive, you can have the part-time, meaning you do have to select if you're going to be in two-wheel drive or in four-wheel drive, which is why it's part-time, because it's only full-wheel drive when you put it in four-wheel drive. But there are some that have an automatic transfer case where you can actually have an automatic four-wheel drive, and I'll show you what I mean. All right, so this is a 2018 Toyota 4Runner, and it's a pretty good example of what I'm talking about for a part-time four-wheel drive. So some 4Runners, depending on the trim, have a knob. Some vehicles have a knob. A lot of them have buttons or turn knobs like this versus a manual selector. But as you can see right here, H2 is for high two-wheel drive. H4 is for high four-wheel drive, so you would turn this into that. And then L4 is the low range four-wheel drive. And again, this is the main differentiation between an all-wheel drive and a four-wheel drive, is having a transfer case where you can go between the 2 and 4, and then having the introduction of a low range in most cases. So again, in this case, if you're driving around every single day, normally in this case, you're going to be powering the back two wheels with the four-wheel drive. And then if you do run into snow or mud or something like that where you need four-wheel drive, you have to select four-wheel drive. Now, a lot of these vehicles will let you select four-wheel drive on the fly. There's some limitations to that, but you do have to move them between. And then the low-range gear is basically a crawler gear. So if you're in a really tricky situation, you need to maximize your power. You're really only going to max out about 25-30 miles an hour before you start really wearing things out. But if for low speeds, just getting out of like sand or mud, that is what the low range gear is for. And I'll be honest, most people that have four-wheel drive have never used that. All right, so now let's talk about a full-time four-wheel drive system. So here's a 2013 4Runner Limited. And one of the key features for all the limited 4Runners is the fact that they do give you a full-time four-wheel drive. So look, this is the same knob that we were looking at before, but you notice the stamps here are different. So now you have H4F, H4L, L4 Air, all kinds of stuff like that. So the big deal here is there is no selectable two-wheel drive. This is H4F for high 4 full-wheel drive, which is the main difference. So ideally, when you leave this here, because there is no option for two-wheel drive, this 4Runner is going to act like an all-wheel drive system and electronically engage, or might be vacuum actuated, but regardless, it's going to engage and disengage the four-wheel drive system as needed so that you can get your tighter turning radiuses, get better fuel economy ideally, but also kick into four-wheel drive when you need it for ice, snow, mud, wet grass, things like that. Now, this four-wheel drive, or this full-time four-wheel drive system is not new. It's been around for a while, but it's generally a more advanced transfer case, meaning it's also a more expensive system. And but as more and more time goes by, more and more vehicles are introducing this feature into their cars. So that was a 4Runner, but let me show you some others that have it. Here's a 2019 GMC Denali 1500, and I apologize, the doors are locked. I don't have the keys handy for it. But if we look right here on the dashboard, you can see this one has buttons for the four-wheel drive. Obviously, the up and down arrows are for the high range and low range. You can see there's the two-wheel drive button, but we also see auto. So this truck does have an auto four-wheel drive system. And it's not just those. A lot of F-150s now have the auto four-wheel drive. It's not all of them. You really have to look on the window sticker or the spec sheet to make sure you're getting what you maybe want. But a lot more trucks like these full-size trucks are having the auto four-wheel drive as well. Now, one of the most common or popular cars that I see that has this feature, and most people don't know, are these Lexus GX and LX 460s and the LX 570s. Now, this one's a 2019, but they have had this feature all the way back to the early 2000s when these first came out. But if we look right here, it's just like the 4Runner Limited, where you have the low range and high range, but it's an automatic four-wheel drive system. So this is another one that doesn't have a two-wheel drive only mode. It basically disengages and re-engages on its own like an all-wheel drive vehicle. Now, I could go into a lot more detail about some of the advanced features of four-wheel drive. You know, Toyota's got the A-Track system. Ford has like a crawl system now too. There's all kinds of terrain modes and front lockers and rear lockers and actual mechanical locking differentials, but I could save that for another video. So now let's just talk about why you might choose an all-wheel drive versus a four-wheel drive. So a lot of people, again, being in the mountains here in North Carolina, think that you have to have a four-wheel drive vehicle because we're in the mountains, and a four-wheel drive vehicle is rugged and it's tough, and that's exactly what you need for the mountains, but that's not always the case. In reality, yes, most traditional four-wheel drives are built beefier. Most of them are on body-on-frame vehicles like the 4Runner, like the 1500s, you know, like all of these trucks and bigger SUVs are. So there are larger components. There is a, you know, much larger diameter drive shaft. So they are a much more sturdy component. But I'm going to be maybe a little bit controversial and say, I don't think you need to have a four-wheel drive to get around properly here in the mountains. And I'll tell you why. So what I like about an all-wheel drive system is, again, it's basically full-time. You do nothing, you crank the car, you put it in drive, you go. Unless you're like me, who likes to take a vehicle off-road and kind of test the limits, whether it be in the snow or in the mud or something like that. Most people don't really care to mess with buttons and selectors and things like that. So what I like about all-wheel drive is it is much more idiot-proof, if you will. All you got to do is drive the car. The computers are going to do a really good job at actually knowing what the car needs to do to get traction, and especially with good tires. And I'll tell you, that matters more than anything, even on a two-wheel drive car. If you have the right tires, an all-wheel drive car will a lot of times outperform a four-wheel drive car in like normal conditions. The only real advantages that come with a four-wheel drive vehicle like Tacomas, 4Runners, trucks, things like that, is probably less to do with the four-wheel drive aspect and more with the fact that they have better ground clearance. Traditionally, a lot of trucks, especially 4Runners and Tacomas, have better tires. And I mean like all-terrain tires, maybe mud and snow tires, things like that, that do get better traction. And sometimes that extra durability does come in handy if you're going over super tricky stuff. But under normal conditions, I actually think an all-wheel drive is better. One last note about all-wheel drive. We always think about, you know, all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive when it comes to snow this time of year and with off-roading and all that kind of stuff. But the other advantage that all-wheel drive has is in just regular year-round driving. Let's think about summertime. That's not when you think about snow and needing that kind of traction. However, it rains a lot in spring and summer, and the all-wheel drive systems do give you a little bit better stability if you're going through mud puddles, you know, that might be on the road, like rain puddles, things like that. If you're going around a corner and one of your rear tires starts to lose traction, it can actually use that all-wheel drive system to kick in and get that traction back. So the all-wheel drive system is a much more year-round, user-friendly option versus a four-wheel drive, which, I'll be honest, I sell a lot of four-wheel drive vehicles here, and if I were to poll the percentage of people that have bought or own a four-wheel drive vehicle right now and ask them when the last time they put it into four-wheel drive was, I would be willing to bet that 1 out of 5 have probably actually used their four-wheel drive. And I'd be willing to bet that out of those, even fewer, I don't know what percentage, but even fewer would even ever tell you that they've used the low range gear, or honestly could even give you a decent explanation of what the heck that even does. So yeah, I hope that this video was helpful. I'm sure there's going to be people that are going to disagree with me. I'm sure there's probably some fact that I screwed up and I'll be corrected on, and I'd be more than happy to hear all of that. So let me know what you think. Again, this is Brian over here at Fred Anderson Toyota in Asheville. Love to hear what you want to say. Have a great day.